The Book of Inverted Prayers. Whoever reads it aloud never sleeps again. Some prayers were written to bring light, others to prevent her from returning. Imagine finding, among the piles of junk at a flea market, a book that seems to breathe and whose pages can only be read in front of a mirror. A book that promises liberation, but in exchange for your sleep. Because whoever reads it out loud never sleeps again. In the following scenes, you'll discover what really happens when sacred words are turned upside down, and how a simple misreading can awaken something that has been sealed away for centuries. The book does not ask to be understood. It asks to be continued in the name of a broken dream. If you believe that faith and fear cannot occupy the same space, this video will prove otherwise. But before you go through the looking glass with me, subscribe, activate the bell, and stay until the end. Because every prayer has an echo, and the echo of this book is still being heard. Sunday dawned overcast with a leaden sky. The antiques fair in the city center smelled of rust, mildew, and damp wood. Elias walked among the stalls with the distracted curiosity of someone who seeks nothing and ends up finding everything. It was then that he saw the tent, different from all the others. The fabric was dark wine, the interior lit by low, flickering candles, and the air inside seemed cooler. In the center of the table, a single object drew attention: a thick book, bound in black leather, with an inverted cross engraved in bas relief. The seller, a thin man with pale eyes, watched silently. "Not for sale," he said before Elias could even open his mouth. The sign, instead of repelling him, drew him in. Elias leaned closer and ran his finger along the cover. The leather was warm, almost pulsating, and smelled of ancient incense. The man watched him as if watching a mistake happen. "If you take it, don't read it aloud," he whispered. Elias laughed. "It's just Latin, and I translate well." He paid the price the reluctant vendor accepted. As he left, he felt the air in the market distort slightly, as if he had passed through an invisible curtain. At home, he placed the book on the table, turned on a dim lamp, and noticed something unsettling. The leather reflected no light. He pulled the lamp closer, and the inverted cross symbol seemed to move in the light. The pages were yellowed, their margins covered in small, inverted religious drawings. The letters, mirrored, could only be read with the aid of a mirror. The text seemed to breathe. Each line pulsed with an irregular rhythm, as if it had a heartbeat. Elias tried to laugh at his own imagination, but upon turning the first page, he saw a tiny inscription at the bottom, written backward. He placed a mirror in front of it and read aloud, half amused, half tense, "Pray to me backwards, and sleep will never overtake you again." The sentence seemed to change the air around him. The lamp flickered once, the wall clock stopped, and silence filled the room. Elias slammed the book shut and took a deep breath. He tried to blame it on fatigue, the wine from dinner, the hint of fear. Still, before falling asleep, he left the book on the nightstand, as if defying his own fear. That night, he dreamed of an empty church, candles lit backward, and voices reciting prayers backward. When he woke, he was in a cold sweat. The clock ticked to 33. The book, closed, lay on his chest, though he swore he had left it far from the bed. Elijah stood, trembling, and returned it to the table. But when he looked again, he noticed something that had not been there before. The cross on the cover now seemed to have been drawn in ash, and in the center of it was a word he had not read before, engraved in low relief. "It begins." The beginning. All day long, Elias tried to pretend the book didn't exist. He placed it on a high shelf, behind old dictionaries and encyclopedias, as if hiding something from his own gaze. Still, every time he passed through the room, he felt the black leather watching him. The symbol on the cover seemed to move, always pointing toward the window, as if it wanted to escape. As night fell, rain began to beat against the window panes, and the wind made the lampshades sway. The light flickered in rhythmic intervals, a rhythm similar to breathing. Elias, curious and rational by nature, decided to face his fear. He brought the book back to the table and placed beside it an oval mirror he'd inherited from his mother. The inverted letters intrigued him. He opened it to the first prayer and with a nervous smile began reading the mirrored Latin, mentally translating each line. The words had a sharp, heavy sound. They sounded wrong, as if the sacred language were being folded backward. In the name of broken sleep, and turned off the light. The syllables vibrated in the air like taut strings. Suddenly, the sound of the clock stopped. He looked at it. The stopped, hand-marked VH33. His heart raced. He tried to continue reading, but the lamp flickered violently and a cold breeze blew through the room, even with the windows closed. The smell of burning wax filled the room. Elias stepped back, staring at the paper. The letters were incandescent, glowing red. The words he had just read burned, as if the fire were coming from within the pages. He tried to close the book, but the cover felt stuck, too hot to touch. The lamplight went out completely, plunging everything into darkness. For a moment he heard the unmistakable sound of someone whispering his name, Elias, coming from inside the mirror. He turned his face sharply, his heart pounding. There was no one there, but the reflection, for a second, showed something that shouldn't have been there. A shadow standing behind him, the book open in its hands. The mirror cracked. The crack made Elias scream. He ran to his room, locked himself in, and tried to laugh off his own hysteria. Lack of sleep, that's all, he muttered, lying down. But his body trembled. He fell asleep exhausted, and when he woke, the room was completely dark. The digital clock blinked, C33 in red. His body felt heavy, a heat burning in his back. He struggled to his feet, stumbling to the bathroom mirror, and what he saw made his stomach turn. 3 deep scratches crisscrossed his back, parallel, precise, fresh. Blood trickled slowly, and on the pillow, burned, was written in ashes, "In the name of a broken dream, in the name of broken sleep." Elias collapsed to the floor, breathing heavily. He swore he could hear down the hall the sound of pages turning on their own. The prayers continued to be read by a voice that wasn't his. On the bathroom mirror, the inverted words began to appear on their own, as if etched by steam. I woke up. Elias woke up with his body aching and his mind confused. The memory of the early morning seemed like a nightmare, but the broken mirror and the burned pillow were there, cold, silent proof that something had happened. He tried to rationalize, sleepwalking, perhaps hallucination. He threw the book into a box and locked it in the closet, vowing never to touch it again. But fear, like any pact, doesn't disappear with intention alone. He falls asleep and waits for the next call. That night, he went to bed early. The rain had returned, and the steady sound of drops on the roof seemed to lull him. He fell asleep too quickly, as if his body had finally given in to exhaustion, but at 3:33 woke suddenly without knowing why. The digital clock flashed red, the room was cold, and the silence was almost solid. A soft noise broke the stillness, the sound of paper being turned. The box where he had kept the book was open, the closet wide open, and the book resting on the desk, open in the half-light, with the pages moving by themselves, as if they were breathing. Elias approached slowly. The text on the page was new. The sentences were no longer the same. The words were rearranged, shifted, and at the bottom a line written in dried blood. "Repeat me, and I will show you what is between the dreams." He tried to close it, but the cover felt alive, pulsing like warm flesh. He felt the heat rise through his fingers. The leather burned, but he couldn't let go. And against his will, he began to read aloud. The pronunciation came too easily, as if the words were already in his mouth. As the last verse ended, the clock stopped again. The air thickened, and the sound of the wind turned to voices. They weren't speaking. They were praying. A chorus of deep male voices sang inverted prayers in a hypnotic cadence. Elijah covered his ears, but the sound came from within him, echoing in his mind. The temperature in the room plummeted. A layer of frost formed on the window pane, and on it, slowly, a word took shape. "I went back," Elias screamed. He ran to the kitchen and turned on all the lights, but they flickered irregularly. 3 flashes. A pause, 3 flashes. 333, always the same number. He felt something scratch his back again. He fell to his knees, and the lights went out. Dawn found him sitting in the living room, the book closed before him, his body in a cold sweat, and his back covered in scratches. The pages were now clean, except for a single freshly written line. Whoever reads, writes the next verse. He decided to lock it in an iron trunk and store it in the basement. But at night, when he tried to sleep, he heard the sound of the pages rustling again. The book was calling him, always at 3:33 a.m., always with the same voice, soft, feminine, serene, repeating the words he shouldn't have uttered, in the name of broken sleep. And then he realized that perhaps the book no longer needed to be read aloud. He already read it from within him. Over the next few days, Elias began to hear sounds coming from inside the cabinet where he had locked the book. At first, it was just a faint rustling, like pages being turned by a non-existent breeze. Then came the whispers, long, drawn-out syllables in a language he recognized but didn't want to understand. Latin, inverted, distorted. The sound came not from the physical world, but from the same part of the mind where prayers and nightmares originate. On the third night, at 3:33 a.m., the sound abruptly ceased. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Elias rose from bed, overcome by a force that was not will. The floor beneath his feet was cold, like church stone. When he opened the cabinet, the book was open, and something alive seemed to move beneath the pages. The letters trembled as if breathing. He recoiled, his heart pounding in time with the text. Suddenly the words began to invert before his eyes. The sentences spun and spun until they became spirals. In the center of the spiral, a new phrase appeared, written in dark red, almost pulsating. "Read me, and I will free you from oblivion." The air grew thick, electric. The lamps went out. The only glow came from the letters, which glinted in the darkness. Elias tried to run, but his body didn't respond. He felt an invisible hand push him forward, forcing him to kneel before the book. His breath became shallow, and the words began to echo alone in the room, spoken by a voice coming from the walls. A voice that seemed to be his own, but a little deeper, a little older. The echo filled the room. Each word uttered reverberated like a drumbeat. Elias realized, horrified, that the book was praying to him. Each verse read was a blow to his mind, as if the text had tattooed itself on his thoughts. And the more he tried to remain silent, the more the words repeated themselves. The altar candles he'd kept unlit lit one by one. Their fire flickered, but not a single spark went out. The flames danced in circles, forming a kind of seal on the floor. In the center, the book, and all around, the shadows cast kneeling figures, dozens of them bowed, praying backward. Elias recognized the murmurs. They were the same sounds from his dreams, monks, centuries distant, reciting the same inverted prayer that now imprisoned him. Desperately, he tried to interrupt the ritual. He lunged at the book and forced it shut, but the pages seemed glued shut. When he finally succeeded, a scream, or something like a breath of fire, escaped from within the leather. The sound knocked him backward. For a moment, he saw someone's face in the window's reflection. His own face, turned inside, out. The wall clock resumed its movement. 3:34, 1 minute later than the standard. Elias wept with relief, but then realized something terrible. Each candle was now burning downward, dripping wax toward the ceiling. The book had learned to breathe, and with each breath, something on the other side began to awaken. Elias's body began to bear the marks of the book as if it were a living page. Every morning, When he woke up at exactly 5:33, new scratches appeared on his back, his arms, sometimes, his chest, always in pairs, always in the same direction. At first they looked like superficial wounds, but over time the lines began to form patterns, symbols perhaps, and when he observed them in the mirror, he noticed something impossible. The marks changed position, as if his body were being rewritten. During the day, I tried to ignore it. I wore long clothes, applied ointment, and avoided the mirror. But people on the street noticed something strange. At work, colleagues commented on the smell of burning incense that accompanied him. Others claimed to hear murmurs as he passed. Elias pretended not to hear. But at night, when the silence grew denser, it was impossible to ignore the sound of scratching beginning from deep within the skin, as if invisible nails were scratching underneath. He decided he needed to understand. Armed with courage and desperation, he lit a candle and opened the book once more. The leather was cool, almost damp, as if it had absorbed the night air. The pages seemed more alive than before, and in the first line, something new awaited him. Whoever is touched by prayer must carry the writing. Fear made him close the book, but the words were already spoken, recorded somehow. Suddenly, the mirror in the room filled with steam, and letters began to appear on the glass. Elias approached, his heart racing. The words were in Latin, but he understood them perfectly. Blood is ink, skin is the page. The lamp flickered, and something fell to the floor, the cracked mirror from the night before. Elias bent down to pick it up and for an instant saw something reflected behind him, a hunched figure, its skin covered in the same marks as his. But the face was his, except the eyes were closed and the mouth was sewn shut. Panic made him drop the mirror, which shattered into pieces. Each shard reflected a figure in a different position, some kneeling, some standing, all with their hands on their chests, as if in prayer, and all were breathing. The candles in the room lit themselves, and their fire flickered in time with Elias's heartbeat. The scratching sound grew louder. It no longer came from the body, but from the floor, the walls, the wood floorboards. Something was moving beneath the house. And then came the voice, low, hoarse, ancient. The last verse is still missing. Elias fell to his knees, his eyes fixed on the book. The cover trembled, the leather stretched like living skin. He knew what would happen if he read it again. But I also knew what would happen if I didn't read it. In the room, the clock began to turn on its own, the hands reversing time. 3:32, 3:31, 3:30. The book wanted to go back to the beginning, and Elijah realized that each new scratch was a word, a prayer that his own body was writing, and when the last verse was complete, the book would no longer need to exist, because it would be the book. Elias's house was no longer silent. Now, there was a continuous breathing, as if the walls were inhaling and exhaling in a slow, sickly rhythm. The sound mingled with the creaking of the floor, the whisper of the curtains, and the rhythmic ticking of the clock, which, even though broken, insisted on always showing the same time. 3:33. It was as if time had split in two, one visible to the world, and the other underground, which only moved within that house. Elias began to notice that the voice he heard no longer came solely from within the book. It had spread. Now it spoke through the cracks in the wall, through the pipes, through the electrical wires. When he turned off the light, the outlets hissed, and from the sound of the wind, words emerged in reversed Latin. It was no longer a distant whisper. It was a conversation, a dialogue between the house and the air itself. One morning, when he woke up sweaty and out of breath, he heard clearly, "You wrote to me. Now finish me." The voice came from the guest room. He lit a candle and walked there, guided by the sound. As he opened the door, the cold hit him like a blow. The walls were covered in symbols, the same scratches from his skin, now etched into the plaster. Each mark pulsed with a flickering light, like fire under ink. The book lay in the center of the bed, open, its pages completely blank. Elias stepped closer. The candle flame flickered, casting shadows that moved around him. And then the wall whispered again, louder, closer. Writing needs voice. He knew what it meant. The presence wanted him to read it. Again, the house's breathing increased. The air grew thick and the ground vibrated beneath his feet. "Who are you?" shouted Elias, the candle about to go out. And the answer came in an echo, mixed with the sound of pages being turned. The first voice that was inverted. Suddenly, a memory that wasn't his own invaded his mind. Monks kneeling in an ancient monastery centuries ago, copying prayers backward as penance. Each one, upon finishing a line, bled on their fingers. The ink was their own, blood. And when the last monk died, the book was buried beside him. Elias saw it as if he were there, but then one of the figures raised its head and looked him straight in the eye, and it was him. The candle went out. The room plunged into darkness, and words began to write themselves in the air, traced by red lights like embers. Whoever reads, rewrites. Whoever rewrites, revives. The wall's voice turned to a groan, then to laughter. Elias stumbled back. The shadows of the walls now surrounded him. A face began to form between the cracks, a huge mouth opening where paint had been, and from him came the final whisper of that night. There is no silence. For those who awaken the reverse. The sound faded, and everything stopped. But at dawn, Elijah noticed the cracks had disappeared. In their place, a single inscription stood out on the white wall. 3:33 a.m. Live page. Desperate and without answers, Elias sought out the only person who still seemed capable of helping him. Father Augusto, an old friend of his family, known for his skepticism and serenity. When the priest answered the door, he immediately noticed Elias's condition. His eyes were empty, the circles under his eyes were deep, and his hands trembled like those of someone who no longer knew how to distinguish between dream and reality. "Father, there's something inside my house," he said, almost whispering, as he held out the book wrapped in a dark cloth. Augusto, with a weary look, accepted the package and asked him to follow him to the sacristy. He lit candles, opened the Bible, and began a brief prayer in Latin. Elias felt a momentary relief, a brief respite from the voices that tormented him. But when the priest unwrapped the book, the atmosphere seemed to deflate, as if the air had been sucked into the leather cover. The candles flickered. The Bible on the table closed by itself. The priest looked up, visibly disturbed. Where did that come from? Elias explained everything. The market, the vendor, the sleepless nights, the marks on his body. Augusto listened in silence, but his face lost color with each detail. Finally, he leafed through the book carefully. He stopped on a nearly translucent page where Latin letters moved on their own, swirling like insects trapped under glass. He made the sign of the cross, but his hand paused in midair, trembling. That's not prayer. It's a reversal. What? A text that was created to undo a blessing. Every word is the opposite of a prayer. Someone turned faith into a mirror, and when you read it aloud, you gave voice to what had been silenced for centuries. Elias watched him in panic. The priest closed the book, trying to tie it shut with a rosary. But the leather pulsed, alive, and the crucifix melted as if it were made of wax. A smell of burning iron filled the air. The priest's face tightened. "It's not a cursed object," he said softly. "It's a vessel." The silence stretched on until it became unbearable. "Container of what?" asked Elias, almost out of breath. The priest stared at him. "Of a soul that does not want to sleep." Before they could say more, the sacristy clock rang 3 times. Augusto looked confused. It was 23 p.m., but the tolling sounded like funeral bells. The windows slammed shut, and a gust of wind scattered the candles across the floor. The book fell from the table and opened by itself, revealing a new page written in fresh letters, as if they had just been printed. He Who tries to silence me will be the next to wake up." The priest recoiled, horrified. He tried to pray, but the words came out the wrong way. Elijah screamed, and everything around him began to vibrate. When the wind died down, the book was closed again, and the priest was on his knees, tears in his eyes. "You must burn it," he whispered, "but know that by doing so, something awakened will want to return to its owner." Elias stared at him without answer, and for the first time, he was sure that the voice that called him every night was not coming from outside. She was already inside him. Elias returned home with the book wrapped in the same dark cloth, his hands sweaty, and the feeling of the leather pulsing against his skin like an anxious heart. The priest's advice echoed in his mind: burn it. But there was a problem. The mere thought of it made the air around him vibrate, as if the book could hear him. He waited for nightfall. The wind blew hard. The streetlights flickered at regular intervals, and the clock, always the same, tickled. 8:38. Elias placed the book in the center of the fireplace, surrounded by candles, and poured alcohol over the black leather. A dry crack cut the silence. I struck the match, and the flame flickered for a moment before growing bright orange. He tossed the match and stepped back, but the fire refused to touch the book. The flame circled the object as if repelled, creating a perfect circle of air around it. Elias poured more alcohol, shouted, pushed with a red-hot iron. Nothing. The leather merely glowed, and for a brief moment he heard a low, deep sound, like someone sighing in relief. The fireplace went out on its own. The smell of sulfur filled the room. The book began to vibrate, as if breathing heavily. The pages opened by themselves, and one of them partially caught fire, but without being consumed. The letters, now read, moved like living worms, rewriting sentences in an unknown language. Elias felt the heat increase, not from the fire, but from within him. The skin on his back burned, and looking in the living room mirror, he saw that the markings had changed again. Now they formed a perfect circle, with symbols similar to those on the open page. The voice then came from within the fire. "I do not burn. I was the fire." Elias stumbled back in horror. The book leaped from the fireplace, falling open onto the wooden floor. The edges of the pages sparked like embers. The sound of inverted prayers echoed throughout the house, and shadows began to form on the walls, kneeling figures, their faces distorted, repeating a prayer in unison. "Free me, but not in peace. Set me free, but not in peace." The entire room began to spin. Elias felt the thin air, the floor pulsing beneath his feet, and the smell of burning iron invaded his lungs. He tried to run, but the house seemed to have swallowed him. Each step brought him back to the same place, in front of the book, where a blue flame now erupted from the center of the pages, outlining a silhouette. It was a human figure, but without a face. The flame danced like a veil over the void, and the sound of the voice grew clearer. "You woke me up. Now carry me." The flame suddenly went out. The book fell, cold, to the ground. Elijah, trembling, picked it up with a cloth and ran to the backyard. He buried it hurriedly, praying aloud. But as he threw the last shovelful of dirt, he heard the muffled sound of pages being turned underground. The next day, when he woke up, the book was on his desk again, dry, intact, and a new phrase engraved on its cover: "Fire is just the beginning of the word." That night, Elias didn't sleep. The book, now back on the table, seemed to breathe with him, the leather expanding and contracting silently like a sleeping animal. The voices had stopped, but the silence was worse. There was a tension in the air, as if everything around him was waiting for something. In the center of the cover, the engraved letters began to move, slowly, rearranging themselves until they formed a new phrase in mirrored Latin. He had to use the antique mirror to read it. "There remains one verse. Whoever reads it will be made complete. There is one verse left. Whoever reads it will complete it." Elias felt his stomach churn. The priest had said the book was a vessel, but he hadn't explained what exactly. Now he understood. The text wasn't incomplete by accident. The book needed someone, a human voice, to finish what the monks had begun centuries before, and by completing the last verse, the soul trapped within would finally have a body. He tried to resist. He locked the mirror, turned off the lights, covered the book with a thick cloth, and placed weights on it. But sometimes, the candles in the house lit themselves. The cloth began to move as if something were breathing beneath. Elias heard the sound of pages turning, and this time a soft, almost sad female voice echoed close to his ear. "Please, finish what you started." He froze. The voice didn't sound demonic, it sounded human, tired. He leaned over the table and lifted the cloth. The pages were open, and the text, previously inverted, now seemed almost legible. There were gaps, blank spaces between the lines, and in the center of the last page, an incomplete sentence. "And when the last reader says my name, the veil between worlds will..." The rest disappeared into smudges of dried ink. Elias realized that part of the text was being written slowly, word by word, in time with his breathing. It was the book, writing through it. An inexplicable impulse made him pick up the antique quill lying on the table. He dipped it in the ink, red, thick, metallic, and finished the sentence without understanding why. "Will open." Instantly the ground shook. The clock crashed against the wall. The air grew heavy, and every candle in the house burst into flames. Elijah fell backward, feeling his body vibrate. The book floated above the table, its pages spinning at an absurd speed, making a sound like beating wings. The inverted prayers returned, this time louder, coming from all directions. Amidst the confusion, a bluish light began to take shape. A woman, or something that resembled one, emerged from the book. Ancient robes, pale face, eyes closed. Her voice was no longer a whisper but a chant. "He who freed me will sleep in my place." Elias tried to flee, but his legs wouldn't respond. His body stiffened, the air thinning. The woman opened. Her eyes, two deep, endless black spheres. She touched his face gently as if in gratitude. The book fell, closed, to the floor. Absolute silence. In the mirror of the room, there were now two figures, one standing, alive, and the other kneeling behind, with skin marked by inverted prayers. And the clock for the first time didn't show 3:33. He had simply stopped. The next morning, the house was quiet. The sun filtered through the cracks, illuminating dust particles suspended in the air. And in the middle of the room, the book lay closed, untouched, its leather cold and opaque as ancient stone. Elias was nowhere to be seen. No sound, no trace of a struggle. Only the echo of something silent, almost spiritual, hovering between the walls. Hours later, Father Augusto arrived. He had felt a weight on his chest during the night, a premonition that led him across the city before dawn. Upon entering, he noticed the smell of wax and smoke, like that of an interrupted mass. He called out for Elias, but the answer came in a different way. The clock, motionless, began to strike 3 times. 3:33. The priest approached the table and saw the book. The cover was different. It no longer bore the inverted symbol, but rather a circle of Latin words engraved in low relief, arranged like a seal. He recognized one of them, sleep, sleep. As he touched the leather, he felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The object seemed asleep, but it pulsed, as if breathing. He opened it cautiously. The pages, once yellowed, were now clean, all except the last. There, a new handwriting filled the empty space. Recent letters, written with a steady hand. The verse is completed. The reader rests in the mirror. The priest looked around and spotted the old, cracked mirror on the wall. The crack, curiously, had disappeared. The glass now reflected the room perfectly, but something was wrong. In the reflection, a shadow stood in the background, motionless, faceless, watching him. Augusto made the sign of the cross and tried to close the book, but the pages began to move on their own. The text reappeared at an absurd speed, as if being rewritten by invisible hands. Latin phrases formed and dissolved. The priest stepped back, and the mirror began to vibrate, emitting a deep, low sound. A female voice echoed from within. "He sleeps in me, and the verse must go on." The priest dropped the book and ran out, but before he could cross the threshold, he heard the glass shatter. He turned just enough to see the mirror's surface shatter into 1,000 fragments, each reflecting a different face of Elias, all eyes open, motionless, staring. In the following days, the house was sealed. No one dared enter. They said that at night they could hear the sound of pages turning, and that sometimes a candle would light by itself in the window, casting a curved shadow on the wall. The priest tried to report it, asking for the book to be removed, but everyone who approached felt sick, dizzy, and had a strange urge to sleep. Months later, a new buyer acquired the property at auction, a young antiques dealer fascinated by religious objects. While exploring the basement, he found a wooden box buried between the rafters. Inside, the book, clean, intact, and with a new inscription on its cover, "Prayer Restored." Verse, "Waiting." He smiled, intrigued, and opened it to the first page. The letters, now perfect, formed before his eyes, mirrored, shining like living ink, and the old clock, somewhere in the house, began to tick 33 again. In the dusty hallway mirror, a shadow moved its lips. "In the name of a broken dream, in the name of broken sleep," and the cycle began again.